So we had a weekend where only a couple people could show up to game, so we played Crown and Skull, and got it to the table this weekend. I don't think that it changes sort of my thoughts on the game considerably. um, so let's talk about it. I do so we did create custom characters. I think that was the highlight. I think by far, I think the players really enjoyed putzing with the characters and they're a buildy group, right? They like builds, they like character builds, and they like the min maxing a little bit and trading off, points over here for points over there. One character did make a mage and wanted to create custom spells. That took a little longer than maybe it ought to have. But but overall, I thought that was a pretty positive experience. Now, I did see a lot of the things I thought I was going to see. I did see a lot of, oh yeah, I have a deadly weapon. I did see, every spell had ineffable because again, it barely hinders the spell for, especially for a one shot. So So I still think balancing is in order a little bit, but I don't think but I think everybody enjoyed it and thought that was a pretty positive part of the game. The actual adventure itself, I just wrote up like 5 or 6 pages of you know they were investigating a missing ring in a city, so it was light investigation, a little bit of light social, and the game mostly got out of the way there, in the sense of, I mean, much like any game of ours would get out of the way there, we, uh, we were just mostly talking. There weren't a ton of skill checks. Now, keep in mind that's one thing where I do think you have to be careful with Crown and Skull because everyone that I saw play it got it wrong. In Crown and Skull, you buy skills. They're fairly expensive compared to the rest of your character. You only have probably 3 to 5, maybe 6 of them if you're very frugal, and they represent, in my opinion, what I've read and what I've sort of gathered from the game and the forums, is they represent something extraordinary. You might have a rope ladder. Everyone can climb it. That's not an issue. Or a tree or a rock. Everybody can climb that rock. Only the guy with climb can do the sheer surfaces or the very difficult slick surface or the difficult climb. There's no default for skills. I saw one group do, well, everybody has a 6 in everything. I'm like, nope, that was just an example of a flat roll. It has nothing to do with skill use. So you do have to be careful because I do think that's one of the things where, having that limited skill inventory, it does hurt the game a little bit, in the sense that you cannot then sort of base a lot of your adventure's connective tissue on making skill rolls necessarily because A, there's a lot of skills a small party's not going to have, and B, they're going to suck at most of them because, you know, a lot of skill based games are based on the idea that if you buy the base level of skill at a base level of difficulty, it's a 50-50 shot. Hero does this. GURP sort of, right? Like a lot of games have that balance point where it's like, it's about a wash if you base level skill, base level difficulty, and then we adjust from there. Base level skill technically in Crown and Skull is 3 points. It's a 15% chance to do anything. So it's way closer to the first edition D&D thief skills where it's like, well, these are extraordinary circumstances and no one else can do these. You have a 15% chance. Good for you, right? So you can't. So it makes it harder to go, well, make a couple investigate checks or make a lockpick check to get through this door because What I would suggest actually is a couple things. One thing I would suggest is, um, for most parties, is that only one person has to make the skill check to drag you all through that particular skill sequence. So if you're sneaking past the guards, only the stealthy guy has to make the check. Just the rest of you can't be doing something like wearing noisy armor or anything, right? Um, or yeah, it's a difficult climb, but if the climber makes it, he can then toss a rope down to you and get you all up, kind of thing. And that takes a little bit of the pressure off the party. If you do have two people with the skill, then allow the lower end guy, the guy with the lower skill, to make a check to give the higher guy a bonus. And just sort of roll with that, because then that takes the pressure off. You can have a character, you can have characters with three or four skills, and they can still you can still then have skill checks during your game mean something. Um, that's the first thing. The second thing I would actually suggest is to consider putting like a base level of difficulty throughout the adventure and saying, "Hey guys, this is an introductory adventure. You're all going to have a +4 to any skill check you make. That way, a character with a 5 actually has a shot to get something done." And then obviously that as you play, that difficulty modifier moves to 0 or it moves to making things more difficult, but I would start and say, guys, +4 to everything. Done. Because this is an easy adventure. Because again, you just don't have enough points to buy 12s in your skills, which would give you a 60% chance of success. You might have a couple nines, you know, but it's very difficult. And again, it's roughly balanced again too. Some of those skills have mechanical, actual, honest to god value in the game, and then you have knowledge, which means, well, you can win a trivia contest in whatever, right? I mean, and those cost the same. So the other thing, which again I think is difficult, is you can't define your character via your skill list like you could in Hero, for instance. In Hero, you can be the young fisherman who's training to be a priest, who, right? I have survival, but I also have knowledge of the river, and like you can buy a bunch of sort of padding skills to. Now, is that a good design for Hero? I don't know. Um, but it does make your skill list feel like your character. In Crown and Skull, you just don't quite have enough of that. Yeah, and you certainly don't have points to buy frivolous skills that just round out the character. You just don't. So, um, nonetheless, we managed with those sort of quick house rules. We did manage. We made a couple skill checks, some successful, some not, um, and move the characters through the adventure, through their investigation, um, of this missing ring. Another thing that we did do, and yet again, this is one where it's very interesting, because I always feel that when you abstract an idea or collapse an idea in a game, but in a tabletop role playing game especially, but if you do that, you have to be ready to either not be able to answer questions about that idea, or you have to answer questions about that, and thus you need to. And I get it. This is a very vague thing to say, but and I always point to war games with stuff like this, or initiative systems or whatever. But like, in Crown and Skull, the concept I'm talking about is there's no money; it's all hero points. And so you do get into this weird thing of, well, I have some money to bribe people. How do we bribe them? How much does that cost us? Do we have to spend hero points to bribe a guy to tell us a thing? Do we just fudge that? Do we just not? be it we're not able to do that. And I think what I would do if I were to play Crown and Skull in a larger, in a campaign. So let's not worry. What we did for the adventure was very simple. The patron who wanted to find the ring gave them a sum of money, a bunch of money. And what I said was, that is worth 6 points to the party at the end of the adventure. That money. 2 for each character that played. Figure a couple pieces of gear, right? We're going to divide it into 100 gold, baubles, whatever, coins. And you can use that to bribe or gamble or whatever. And at the end, however much you have left is the amount of 6 points that I will award you. Right? So you sort of upfront say, this is worth 6 points. You have $100. You can spend your bucks like you want. And then sort of a petty cash for the game. And then at the end, we'll divvy those up and give you the points again. So if they spent 16 of those, well, then they end up with 5 points. If they spend half of them, they end up with 3 points, etc. So again, the adventuring worked out well enough. But again, it would have worked out with any game. Like there was no like I said, the game got out of the way. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't mean that in get out of my way game. I mean that in we'd have had the same experience in Hero, Runebearer, D&D 5th. We'd have made a couple of skill checks. We'd have been mostly talking, laughing, doing the thing. It was a good time, by the way. And there you go. We did have one fight at the end of the night. The problem is with the length of time it took to make characters and the when we got started, we didn't have a great amount of time to sort of get the combat going. So we did have a combat 3-on-6 sort of rough against some pretty weak thugs. And I think combat went I think it would take me a little bit of more jostling with the system to be able to produce combats that were exciting and made sense, etc. So one of the mistakes I think I made was we're very much mapped combat people. So I did, quote unquote, map the fight, assuming that you can move 6 hexes in a move. But that immediately begged the question, because here's the problem. Monsters and characters are not written the same way. They don't follow the same rules. And so whereas a player has move, action, or both, hurry, as their options, monsters don't necessarily have that. And so the sort of weird ruling that I had to make was, if a monster is outside of 6 hexes of you, they can move up. And that is their action. Unless they have some missile weapon or something they can use. If they're within 6 hexes, they can move and do their attacks sort of at will. Like they don't have the same move restriction that players do. Right? So if the thugs are very far, they move up. If the thugs are within combat range, and then we roll tactics as normal, and then, they rolled a 2 through 5, they're going to come up and slash. They come up and slash. They can move and slash, not an issue. No bonuses, no penalties to anything, just the normal ones. Done. And if they need to move away, they roll a 1, they move away. Well, they move away, right? They can move their distance and jump away. And I think that preserves the gist of the combat system and the spirit of the combat system. But you could map it. I don't know that it's meant to be mapped as written. I think that 6 inches is very much a guideline, and that you're mostly either just roughly moving miniatures to say who is engaged with whom, as opposed to anything, as opposed to actually representing the battlefield, or it's all theater of the mind. Um, but I do think you could map Crown and Skull, and that maybe you get something out of it. But again, so keep in mind, there's no rules for any of the anything moving on a map, and so and I don't think I think you'd have gotten these questions just even if you did theater of the mind, which was stuff like, well, if the guys are standing outside the door and I am on this side of the door, can I block the door? Can they get past me if I stand in the doorway? Um, right. Oh, can I reach that guy? Can I? Right. I mean, those questions are sort of in there. Um, and because again, there's so I don't know that I think mapping might have been a mistake. I think where I had to play Crown and Skull, I would still map the combats and then explicitly figure out what we were going to do with movement, etc. Um, the fights itself actually work on a 5 phase system, so every combat round is 5 phases. The players choose the phase they want to act on. The monsters have pre-programmed phases that they act on. Um, And so acting on phase one means you're going to go first. On phase five, you're going to go last, etc. And I think that's where a lot of the tactics in the combat actually come into is going, well, now that we've fought these guys once, we know they act on two or they act on three or whatever. So do you want to go before them or after them? And both of these have very explicit advantages and disadvantages based on um, so, for instance, a mage going after a character or after the enemy might not be as effective because their buffs and their debuffs, only last for 1d6 phases. And I do realize now that that 5 phase system is sort of the what makes any of that spell system work, because I bitched a lot about the spell system being, well, if I buff you, it's only going to last 1 to 6 phases anyway. It's not even a combat on average. So I realize that that is sort of the trick, right? So you want the mages to go ahead of either your buddies or the head of the enemy, so that a buff or debuff is going to last you through someone's relevant action. Now, and so that's sort of where the tactics come in. The thing is, I don't know that it's enough tactics, as it were. It really just means, do I want to, so you either don't know when they go, in which case there's no tactics. It's just, well, I'll go on one or two, so I'm ahead of them. Or you know when they'll go because you fought these monsters before, and you go, well, if they're going to go on three, I'm going to go on two. So, for instance, our mage went on two, and the main thugs went on three, and so that was very useful for him. So, for instance, in the case where there's a bunch of thugs and they're outside, and a couple of them rushed in because they went on. They also then went on. Because they had moved last round and came in the room, and then there were still four outside the door. The mage could cast a wall spell, putting a wall across the door. Now, that wall has defense and it has attrition, but that wall only lasted 4 phases. Now, the thing is, that was enough to not allow the enemy to come in. So it actually gave the party a whole round, which, again, I thought was actually a good use of the spells, and it's a good way that a spell with this very ephemeral duration, 1d6 rounds, actually makes a difference. So I sort of see what I did not see in the last part of my review, which is, okay, I get it now. The spell durations are so tiny, but there is at least you could take those if you wanted to start with those spells with that shitty duration, you could, and you could still make a difference with careful plotting of the phases and understanding when to go in the combat round. So I had a little bit more appreciation for that and that system than I did the last part of my review. So kudos to the game designer with that. Um, I don't think combat was bad. I don't think it was super exciting. At least the ones we did. And like I said, I think it would take me a reasonable amount of time to run a bunch of those combats to go, okay, I get it now. This is what we need to do to make these, dangerous or make these interesting. I did a bunch of thugs and a couple uber thugs with more hit points and a different attack, and the party just mopped them. Like, they didn't have enough hit points to stand up to a deadly battle axe. None of them were doing destroy attrition. They were just doing regular attrition, which we random roll. One character had picked. I mean, he spent most of his points on being a badass, right? So he picked, I think, a shield skill of something like 12. Um, Shield defense, right? He got a shield of +2 or whatever, +2 or 3, the big shield. A deadly battle axe, and he just went to town. Now that's half his points, and we also took protector, so most of his points were all rolled into being the combat badass. Now the problem is that that means that not only did he soak most of the attacks, because again these guys, oh here you go, okay they have an attack of 1. Well he still has a pretty good chance of not taking attrition. Now once he takes attrition, obviously that starts to get rough, but he had a pretty good chance of not taking attrition. And he could stop one other guy around from taking attrition because he was nearby, because they were in a relatively small room. So I do think, again, it's one of those where you go, well, I mean, that guy built for combat, and he was going to win most of the combats for most of the party. Um, if they weren't, obviously we could have made bigger dudes, but again, he's doing on average 13 points a round, minus the defense, of course, but 13 points a round. Um, it if the enemies did not have 20 or 30 hit points, which again I didn't quite anticipate. I was like, well, these guys will be minions. They'll be like 5 or 10 hit points, right? So I think they cut them down, and I think that's half on me as well. I think it's just going to take a little bit to consider what makes sense for a given party. How do you fight them? And so I don't think the combat was terrible. I think it was okay. I think we could have done. I think I could have done better plotting it. I didn't know what characters they were going to make before I made the adventure, and so just something to consider, right? It um but again, I do definitely think that were I to play this with my full group and you had 6 of them, I think it would be very difficult to make super challenging fights, because I guarantee you someone would have a warhammer and they would be stunning, or someone would take the brawling skill and be stunning the, like, I think there's a lot of that. I think there's a lot of ways that the players can neuter a lot of encounters. And I think as a GM, you're gonna. I mean, and you get them from the get go. Like it's not, oh, later you can neuter encounters. No, no, no. It's take a deadly warhammer and you've neutered probably a good a an unreasonable number of encounters become neutered if you have a guy with a deadly warhammer. Done. I really, I think, stuff like that. I think if you have enough people doing stuff like that, a guy with an 18 brawling skill. Um, Now, mind you, that's 18 points, so that's ridiculous, but you could. So it's just something to watch out for, something to pay attention to if you're going to GM this game, and watch out for that. That this game plays better if the players don't know what they're doing. If they if they're not going, if the players are going for if you have a couple guys in your group that are going to go for a good combat build, they're going to win a lot of fights, I think, and I think you need to prepare for that and understand that's how it's going to go, and just pay attention, and figure out how you want the combats to go. I think it would take me, like I said, probably a half a dozen combats. I would have sat there and said, okay, well, I'm going to put their characters, and I'm going to sit there on roll 20 or on my table here, and I'm going to fight, and let's see how this actually goes. And like I said, there's ways, right, probably around some of that. Um, a hail of archers, one big guy with a lot of defense. I think you could putz with different things to make that happen. Um, and again, you're also a little bit at the mercy of your rolls as a GM because you're supposed to roll a d6, and they do one of they do x of those things. They do one of three things based on that d6 roll. So you know half the time my big guys weren't getting into the fight. Strangely enough, it's only 1 in 6, but they backed away and caught their breath. And I'm like, come on, guys, it's the start of the fight. Get in there. Stop it. Stop doing that. So we had a little bit of that too. I don't think combat was bad. I don't know. Like I said, I don't think anything about the fights made me want to bring this to the table. I'm not gonna like. I think. Um, I think. I don't think it's a bad game. I think combat wise, I think it might be incompatible with my group combat wise. I think my group is a lot more focused on positioning, facing, right? And this is a lot more for let's play it loose. We want these combats to go fast. We're going to have a lot of them. Like I typically in our games, we don't have a lot of combats in a night kind of thing. We don't have that slew of fights. We have a couple nights every so often. We have a night like that, but we very rarely do we have the slew of fights to get you to the boss. Typically, we have one or two fights to get you to the boss. Um, and that's about it. Maybe one a night kind of thing. And it might be a big fight, but those fights are typically bigger, right? And more telling. And I think this game is a little bit designed with that in mind. It's a little bit more like a basic D&D where it's like, you're going to have to fight the rats, and then you fight the slugs, and then you fight the crazed cultists, and then after 3 or 4 more of those, then you get to the boss kind of thing. It is an attrition system, as it were. So one thing that I did, and we'll end this soon. But the last sort of note was that there's a lot of extra stuff in that book. So, for instance, there's a lot of things about dungeons, and they have this 2d4 dungeon system, and the system for exploring is a 2d10 system. You don't map the dungeons, for instance. You divide it into zones. You write 4 rooms per zone and 4 encounters per zone, and then randomly roll on the combination that you get. And I don't think and that's a fine idea, right? That's cool. And I've used random generation in actually quite a few of my dungeons. Like I like to have a dungeon deck, for instance, and I will draw passages and so on. Or I will have a dungeon which simply is a list of random encounters that they go through. I've done that in the past. I also do mapped dungeons entirely as well. This is another place where I thought in the games that I watched online brought a little bit of confusion. So there was one group that was continuously asking, well, can't we just go back to the other place that we, right? I mean, there was a lot of, well, where are we though? Going on. And I think that's going to happen. And either your group gets used to it or they don't get used to it, or you just change the paradigm back to what you're used to, like a mapped dungeon or whatever. I don't think that would hurt the game to map dungeons. I don't think the 2d4 or the 2d10 for overland exploration is bad. I think it's sort of an interesting concept. I just don't know that I would use it all the time as the default. I actually think, it doesn't reduce my prep time. The only reason it reduces the prep time as written in the game here is because the darn dungeon rooms are like 1 sentence. I think that's, it's like, oh, This terrifying ruin houses a bottomless gulf below. The only way forward, a chance collection of roof beams serving as a footbridge. That's it. That's the room. Yeah, that decreases your GM prep if you're only going to write one sentence per room. Guess what? I've done that also. But that does is that moves the burden to make an on-spot rolling. Well, how do I cross these beams? Oh, make a dex check. We don't have dex. Well, okay, I don't know that. Right? So I think I don't think there's any inherent advantage to using, say, random generation over not random generation specific to Crown and Skull. Like, they could have just said, yeah, map dungeons, and you'd have just been in the same position. It's it's a good idea, and it's a fun idea. And if you come from if you're GMing and you've GM'd D&D, and all you've come is from sort of 5e supplements, then I think that's a breath of fresh air to go, hey, you could randomly roll some stuff in your game, and you could then reduce. But I don't know that it reduces prep time. The only reason it reduces prep time as written in Crown and Skull is because you just write a sentence and then leave it out there. And then if they actually engage with the environment, which they're going to, you then need to start making these other calls on the fly. You could, now that's great if you want to do that, which again, I love doing that, so I'm good. But if you're a GM and you weren't up for just starting to improvise a bunch of skill checks in a game where skill checks might be not easy to resolve, or not easy to balance, then you should have written it down ahead of time anyway, which doesn't reduce your prep time, I suppose, is my take. So as I sort of worked through Crown and Skull, I found myself wondering where the focus of the game was. And by that I mean, like, what does the game, what do the rules bring into sharp focus, and what do they sort of say, hey, you figure it out. So for instance, when I play a lot of tabletop RPGs, including my homebrew, it's combat focus. We bring combat and, say, spell casting and skill resolution. That's the focus. Social interactions, we're gonna fuzz those. We're gonna let you deal with those. Sort of overall, like this current iteration of the homebrew, even like character progression is a little fuzzy and up to some GM interpretation, which allows me to negotiate with my players about it a bit. But I don't think the final written rules are going to be fuzzy there, right? But we focus on its combat. Now, not to say the game has to focus on combat. What I'm saying is we might have sessions go past with none of that happening. Right now, we're dealing with a lawsuit, for crying out loud. That's literally what's going on in the game. But the rules focus on combat. Combat is in sharp focus. If you want to know how to move your character in combat, there are rules for that. If you want to know if you have a zone of control or if facing matters, etc., that it's all in there. And yeah, social encounters are fuzzier. Do you roll one skill check? Do you roll multiple skill checks? Right? Nope. I mean, we don't explicitly say. There is no social encounter resolution mechanic per se. Is that a design flaw? Maybe. Don't know. It's very typical in RPGs, by the way. That is sort of the very typical, where do you focus and where do you fudge. Crown and Skull, I don't necessarily see a focus, weirdly, or I didn't see a focus. I came to a revelation about the focus after playing it over the weekend. But as I putzed with it, I did not see a focus. Character sort of creation was the most focused part, and I think my players reacted to that and enjoyed that the most. Um, but even that's can be fuzzy at times. Like when they got to gear and equipment, they're like, "Wait, there's only 20 items." I'm like, "Well, we can take any item from any game book you want, and it'll be a point probably." And that was sort of you only have three bandages, three torches. How long does a torch last? A scene. How long's a scene? Right, that kind of thing. But it was the most focused part. I don't think combat is super focused. I think it's reasonably clear on the basic idea on how to run it. And again, if you theater of the mind the whole thing, I think you'll mostly be and fudge it. You'll mostly be fine. Exploration. You know, like in a game like I said, a D&D or a Shadow Dark. I think Shadow Dark has a very hard focus on exploration. You explore and you do your dungeon crawl in combat rounds, much like in turns, like everybody like you do. And so I think that's in very sharp focus. I think games like basic D&D, well, I can move 120 feet in a 10-minute period and I roll encounters, right? I think that's very, very sharp focus. I think those games focus on that. And the logistics of, say, a basic D&D, that is the focus of the game. It's how many torches do I have left? How long do I have left in the dungeon? Right? That's the game. That's the focus. Combat is a little less focused, but it's still pretty focused. And again, skill checks totally fuzzy in a basic D&D. So I think I found Crown and Skull to be there's no place where I said, that's the focus. That's where the rules totally put their spotlight and put this part of the game into absolute sharp focus. There's not the same logistics for dungeon crawling in Crown and Skull. I think it's mostly fuzzed. You actually don't care about most of the things you would care about. I don't care about running out of food when I'm exploring. I don't care about running out of torches, for the most part. Um, I just don't. I don't think that's a thing. Um, Combat is, like I said, I think there's a couple rules, but it's like 2 or 3 pages max. Like the whole combat thing is almost a page. Um, and again, I don't think that you're not. That's not where the rules come into sharp focus. I think what it sort of came to me is I'm like, so what's this game about? It's not about logistics. It's not about dungeon exploration. It's not about combat. Uh, for the most part, it is about character generation and progression and the vibe. I think the vibe is the focus. The book has a lot of there's fiction interspersed, of course. There's art. There's a nice map. It's trying to get they talk about different locations in the world, um, and it's all scattered throughout. It's not there's not just a rules part and a non-rules part. Um, I think most of the front of the book is rules, most of it, and most of the back of the book is the atlas of the world and the dungeons and so on and so forth. So take that for what it's. So that is true. But it's more of the vibe that it's trying to give you, and that vibe is this light free form game with a certain world with a Warhammer old worldy feel sort of in the background. Um, that's sort of where it is. It's not a bad book. It's actually a very good book. But I think my verdict still stands. I don't know that it comes together to a complete game. I don't sort of feel. I don't feel like after I play this going, wow, that game made sense. Like that game works in a way that say Hero System really does. If you've ever played Hero System or GURPS, really does. Or the myriad of or first edition AD&D. Even though again, there's a lot of books to troll through to find what that is. I do think at some point that all comes together and works as a system. I think this can work as a system, but there's a lot of places where it just leaves it fuzzy and leaves it up to the GM. And I think it does so on the pretense of being, well, you don't need all that. You can do it. You just figure it out, or the 2d4 that'll get you through. And I don't think it does. So I'm not going to say, I'm not going to say this is, like I said, I don't think this is a bad book. I think it's a good book. Am I unhappy I bought it? No, I'm very happy I bought it. I think I'm going to read through this again, and I'm going to steal a couple bits here and there and use it in some of my own games. I don't necessarily even I think the tactics rolls. I think some of the random generation for stuff, or just even the descriptions of the regions and the map and the illustrations will make this book valuable to me, but I probably ultimately won't play the game as written in this book. I might try to manipulate and steal something from that 5 phase round concept, because I do sort of like that. But again, I don't know that concept transfers well to other games that deal in combat rounds specifically. Like if a spell lasts 3 rounds, that's a long time in Crown and Skull for a spell to last. So something like that. I'm trying to figure out where I land on all that. Like I was thinking, could you run, say, a fantasy hero, so hero system, but not do the 12 phases that you have in hero system? Just assume everyone's speed is the same in the game, and that you have a 5 phase round instead of a 12 phase round, which you do in hero, and sort of work that into the system and let players choose when they go. And I think maybe, right? So I'll think about that. So I think there's ideas in here. I think the ideas are worth stealing. I think as a game, I think there are probably other games that do a better job of getting you there, if that makes any sense. So that's it. This has been a long already. I will talk to you all later. And I might run some more combats and sort of try to get that in my head, how this is supposed to work. And we'll see. So, all right. Anyway, thank you for listening. I will talk to you. Bye-bye.